Greetings from Beirut, Lebanon. It's a pleasure to join you. My remarks today are called "The Present Has Failed. Will the South Open a New Road?" The Human Development Report of 2013 is called "The Rise of the South." The authors of the report assess the remarkable economic fortunes of what are called the emergent economies, mainly the BRICS states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but also others. As the global north settles into a long-term stasis, its lost decade, these emergent economies registered a more gradual slowdown, with some of the countries even able to register modest gains in sections of their economies. That this growth was largely premised on high commodity prices, and that its own foundation was weakened by vulnerabilities such as reliance upon anemic northern demand, did not make an impact on the optimism of this UNDP report. Nor did the optimism register any worry about the dangers posed to the South's powerhouses by hot money flows. Morgan Stanley, in a recent report, considers 5 countries, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and Turkey, as part of its Fragile Five, currencies vulnerable to predatory hot money. In August, the Mexican Central Bank Governor, Agustin Carstens, warned, "The volatility of capital flows has been very pernicious, and to some extent, unconventional monetary policies have affected such volatility." What Carstens referred to was the low interest rates in the north that encouraged a massive carry trade, with finance borrowing low and then moving into unprotected southern financial exchanges with large short-term speculations that have an adverse impact on currencies and on capital formation. High commodity prices, hot money FDI, and of course a growth model that is premised upon enclaves of prosperity amid slums of deprivation. The South has arrived, but it has not arrived in any modular form. Much has to be considered of the emergence of the New South, its political and economic potential, which is not to be denied, but should not be exaggerated. The diagnosis of its arrival needs to be mediated by the dangers that remain in place. The authors of the UNDP report noted that it would be a good idea to establish a new South Commission to bring a fresh vision of how the South's diversity can be a force for solidarity. If such a commission were to be established, and if it were to have the full backing of the BRICS states as it should, what would it propose? Given the weakness I have pointed to and its own hesitation to be a model for anyone, this is not an idle question. If the South does not want to produce an empty model, at the very least, it has in its experiments around neoliberalism produced some new principles to anchor the kind of discussion that would happen at a new South Commission. What would these principles look like? None are clearly outlined, and there is no consensus on common principles, apart from the BRICS core principles of multilateralism and regionalism. But multilateralism and regionalism are not themselves capable of more than helping formulate the scaffolding of a new order. What happens inside that skeleton is the real question, and that is what a new South Commission would have to attend to. What is the South? Geography is a great temptation. When words like South are bandied about, or indeed Europe, there is a sense that these refer to specific latitudes or longitudes, to marks on a map that cut out parts of the earth into this or that landmass. But the South is not a place, somewhere on the nether end of a dividing line that somehow cuts across the Mediterranean, travels eastward across Iran, and then rises above China to sink its teeth into the Rio Grande, leaving Africa, Southern Asia, and South America in a block below a southern meridian. Beneath that line would remain the old settler colonies of Australia and New Zealand, hardly entrance into any definition of the South. Languishing above the meridian would be parts of southern Europe, disparagingly called pigs, whose economic collapse is dire and painful. The University of Athens has recently closed its doors. The home of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle has not the money to run its major institution of higher education. Greece certainly is in the queue, waiting to join the South. The South is not a place. It is the zone most damaged by old colonial histories, neoliberal policies, and by globalization. And it is the strata of human sediment that has most vigorously reacted to this damage by mass political protest. The South today is rooted to some extent in the old third world groupings, countries that are members of the G77 and the non-aligned movement hold the banner aloft for some kind of revived South project. European countries that have been badly mauled by the ascendancy of finance capital, dollar seigniorage, and the monetary trap of the euro are loath to contemplate a break from the European project, yoked as they are to the monetary union, to the siren of the Eurozone market, and to the political benefits of the European Union and NATO. All this is illusionary, as Kostas Lapavitas and Heiner Flassbeck put it recently. Germany has gained a massive competitive advantage within the Eurozone, thus accumulating surpluses and becoming a lender to the world. It has ruined peripheral countries by forcing them into a position of deficits and debts. Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal are in the vice, with France also unsettled by Germany's entrenched comparative advantage. Eastern Europe has not been untouched by these dynamics of misery, and then by the protests that follow. Bulgaria is in the lead, with spectacular demonstrations bringing down a government. Maria Ivancheva says that in Bulgaria, what really stands out between the protesters and emancipatory politics is the neoliberal hegemony of previous decades, which emptied the collective political imagination. There is a hunger for economic and social alternatives that are not at the mercy of international finance, its ratings agencies, local oligarchies, and the bilious rhetoric of the xenophobic right wing. The European project is not capable of producing these new alternatives, rooted as it is in the soil of neoliberal policy. Eastern and Southern Europe would do well to turn south and see what is going on there. The evidence from these past 2 decades of neoliberal policy making is that the model that relies upon privatization and the commodification of the commons is precisely what produces unemployment and poverty. This was why the young people who occupied Wall Street adopted precise percentages to divide themselves from the 1% and consider themselves as part of the 99%. Data from the OECD in its perspective on global development notes that social inequality is growing to dangerous levels. The gap between the rich and the poor widened over the 3 decades that preceded the global credit crunch that began in 2007. Many countries entered the global economic crisis already facing the highest levels of income inequality since OECD records began, said the report, and then it went out of control after 2007. The top 10% in most countries saw gains in the past 6 years as the rest descended into economic insecurity, with the most marked gaps opening up in Chile, Mexico, Turkey, and the United States. The figures that the OECD collects on inequality only tell the beginning of the story. The deeper one digs into the social strata, the more perilous is the fate of the population. Inequality grows not only because of the financial crisis, but more generally, because the mode of production we have is premised on the displacement of labor through mechanization and through the integration of vast labor reserves in the former socialist and third world blocs. Cores of industrial production tantalize vast pools of informal life, settlements premised on disorganized production and fragile access to life-affirming resources. People live in slums, work off the books, and are denied access to the basic fruits of the modern world. This is the geography of neoliberal-led growth. So what is the alternative? There are some policy cliches before us. Create a flexible economy. Bring in business process outsourcing, whether in the information technology sector or in the biomedical, biochemical sector. Hoopla around these paths closes down any possibility of a serious engagement with them. Certainly, business process outsourcing allows for the entry of foreign direct investment, eager to use the magic of wage arbitrage and the new technological pathways to undermine the high wages in the North for the lower wages in the educated enclaves of the South. But there is a quiet consensus in the specialized agencies of the UN and among the analysts of the Bretton Woods institutions that these pathways will be unable to produce the quantity of jobs that are necessary. Furthermore, these sectors are not always the most attuned to the needs of women workers. In the Arab world, the ILO reports, the labor force participation rate of women is what lowers the general rate. The unemployment rate of women is now almost 18% compared to the overall rate of 12%. Any policy that does not specifically tailor itself to this gender divide will not succeed in its objectives. The specific changes that we know as globalization have certainly made the pathways toward equitable growth harder to understand. Three major social projects of the 20th century cradled a policy framework that allowed for national economic development, however restricted, that relied upon the creation of social solidarity as a result of state intervention and popular power, exercised through trade unions as well as other organizational mechanisms. The three are, first, Western European and East Asian forms of social democratic or authoritarian state intervention. Second, Eastern European and Soviet forms of state-led socialism. Third, Third World import substitution programs. Globalization invalidated these three social projects. The fall of the last two projects, socialism and the Third World Project, and the integration of their zones into the world economy increased the workforce and enabled strategies of wage arbitrage to undercut trade unions and many forms of social organization. New technological developments, such as computerization of corporate information and containerization of shipping, enabled firms to disarticulate production across continents. Parts of a factory would be in Malaysia and others in Mexico. This breakdown of the production process, what is called the global commodity chain, undermined the strategy of nationalization. Power went from workers, exercised through trade unions, and states exercised through nationalization, to corporations, often located in the north, but not without their southern counterparts. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher arrived at Cancun, Mexico in 1981 to receive the surrender document from the South, whose North-South dialogue had collapsed in the face of these pressures. But that surrender was premature. In Latin America itself, the harsh inequality produced through the neoliberal reforms of the 1970s led to a series of IMF revolts, leading in some to the political process of Bolivarianism that is now dominant in the region. Here, the idea of regionalism has held sway, with the Latin American states having created new political and economic sets of organizations to buttress this regionalism. The South has been reborn in Latin America. The detritus of neoliberal-led inequality, the ILO notes in its new report, played a major but underreported role in recent mass protest movements in the Arab world, Asia, and Africa. More such protests should be expected as the pent-up anger of the citizens is expressed against the rollback of the state in the areas of unemployment, social protection, and transparency in governance. This is what I consider the South from below, exemplified by the new experiments in Latin America. But there is also the South from above, the BRICS development, which emerged in 2003 through the India, Brazil, South Africa, or IBSA dialogue, to push for room in the policy debates for the IBSA view on agriculture and subsidy regimes. From Cancun in 2003, the IBSA broadened its focus to pharmaceuticals and intellectual property rights, as well as war and multilateralism. Early meetings thrashed out an agenda that would be adopted by the BRICS as they began their meetings in 2009. Why I call them the South from above is simply because they are state-driven projects that are fairly conservative in their approach to change, with a push for the southern powerhouses to earn themselves a seat at the high table and not to revise the order of things. The BRICS platform, therefore, is limited in several ways. The domestic policies adopted by the BRICS states can be described as neoliberalism with southern characteristics, with a focus on sales of commodities, low wages to workers, along with the recycled surplus turned over as credit to the North, even as the livelihood of their own citizens is jeopardized. Rather than turn over the social wage in transfer payments or in the creation of a more robust social wage, the countries seem to follow the World Bank President Robert Zelnick's advice to turn over its surplus to help the global economy recover from the crisis. There is something obscene about making the locomotives from the South pull the wagons of the North, particularly given the North's own reticence to allow for new surplus recycling mechanism to be created during the debt crisis of the 1980s. The BRICS alliance has not been able to create a new institutional foundation for its emergent authority. It continues to plead for more democratic UN and for democracy at the IMF and World Bank. These pleas have made very little headway. The BRICS formation has not endorsed an ideological alternative to neoliberalism. There have been many proposals for the creation of a more sustainable economic order, but these have been relegated to the margins. There is no positive alternative that has been taken forward as yet. It might emerge out of the convulsions from below, where there is no appetite for a system that most people see as fundamentally broken. Finally, the BRICS project has no ability to counter the military dominance of the US and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When the UN votes to allow member states to use all necessary measures, as it did in Resolution 1973 on Libya, it essentially gives carte blanche to the Atlantic world to act with military force. There are no regional alternatives that have the capacity to operate. The US is a global force with bases on every continent and with the ability to strike almost anywhere. Regional mechanisms for peace and conflict resolution are weakened by the global presence of NATO and the US. Overwhelming military power translates into political power. Regardless of their limitations, the South from below and above are on the threshold of a kind of arrival. But having arrived, what will they propose? Alternatives. Better ideas do not by themselves change the world. The suffocation of a certain balance of social forces precludes alternative ideas from being taken seriously. There are hundreds of designs in engineering labs for smokeless chimneys and waterless toilets, but their existence has not meant that they've been adopted for mass usage. It will require a shift in social power to allow new ideas and new technologies to become acceptable in our times. In the absence of such a change, an alternative will simply mean a solution of a practical nature that is not capable of being fully embraced. What is possible within the current dispensation is social welfare. Though this is not a systematic alternative, it is nothing to be scoffed at. When the social crisis is acute, as it is now, any form of relief is to be welcomed. Measures to bring down the prices of foodstuffs, provision of unemployment benefits, or government employment schemes are necessary, but they should not be confused with an alternative path. Does this mean that alternatives are impossible? Far from it. And just to give you a sense, here are three broad principles toward an alternative. First, universal access. The idea of basic needs came out of the UN and then was impounded by the neoliberal framework of the Millennium Development Goals. What was lost in the Millennium Development Goals accountancy was the principle of universal access by every person to certain basic needs: food, healthcare, employment, social security. The core demand of the Basic Needs Campaign is clear to the majority of the world that access must be institutionalized. Those in authority know that they cannot discount these demands. What they do is to accept them in principle and then hollow them out in implementation. They say that universal access is too expensive. Well, it is certainly expensive, but it is not beyond our means. Given the way the social surplus is appropriated by very few and is spent on war and security, such demands are certainly impractical. But that is a political problem, not an economic one. Because it is a political problem, two elements have to be considered: the growth of political movements to champion and defend universal access, and the role of UN agencies to monitor such access. The first principle, universal access. The second, economic power. When economics became a technical science, it abjured considerations of economic power. It seems an embarrassment to talk about land reforms and trade unions. Control over land is crucial in Africa and Asia, where farmers continue to battle against all odds to maintain their sovereignty over their livelihood. Alongside this lingering and urgent demand for control over land is that of control over industrial processes. The global commodity chain has annulled the policy of nationalization, rendering mute the ability of a state to take hold of its industrial plants. This means that those whose tentacles stretch across continents exercise power over industry. These multinational corporations had once been studied by the UN at the Center for Transnational Corporations, set up in 1974 but closed down in 1993 under US pressure. It is hard for workers to build their own power against their firms, leading to the catastrophic accidents as in Bangladesh. And it is hard for the UN to even study the way in which corporate power operates outside the purview of democratic accountability. If the UN cannot take hold of multinational companies, it certainly has no regulatory authority over money. Seemingly mysterious social forces hidden behind rating agencies and ideas such as confidence in the markets dampen the ability of states to widen their policy framework. If novel policy decisions are taken, money goes on strike. The price of borrowing is a form of power that is rarely understood in public, and the idea that economics is a kind of undecipherable hieroglyphic simply reinforces the undemocratic way in which money commands economic activity. The first principle was universal access, the second is economic power, the third is the social wage. Any investigation of an alternative in an age of ecological crisis and structural unemployment has to take seriously the forgotten idea of the social wage. Better public goods, forged with the best of today's science, would not only reduce the burden on individuals and families, but it would enable societies to create socio-ecological solutions to problems. Rather than using private cars with high insurance premiums, people should use more public transport, such as light rail. The focus should be on high-quality public rather than private healthcare. These are elementary policies burdened by the calculated failures of the public sector in an earlier era and overshadowed by the highly subsidized private sector of our time. Absent a discussion about the creation of public goods, it is doubtful if any solution to the climate catastrophe can be thought out. This is the framework of an alternative. These are the principles that should anchor the new thinking if there is to be a second South Commission. And certainly, it should be a formulation that should be taken seriously by those of us who are interested in ideas of development and social justice. Thank you very much.